Sometimes the difference between 800 men coming home and 800 families receiving telegrams is one soldier willing to disobey a direct order. The manual said, never break radio silence during contact. Division command had been explicit. Unauthorized transmissions would result in immediate court-martial. But when Corporal Eddie Vickers watched German artillery zero in on his battalion's position, he knew following orders meant watching everyone around him die. He was 21 years old, a radio operator from a town so small most maps did not mark it, and he had noticed something the officers with their war college degrees had missed. The German forward observers were using a predictable frequency rotation to coordinate fire missions. Predictable meant vulnerable. Vickers could disrupt their communications with a signal trick so simple it violated every doctrine about electronic warfare. But he had 40 minutes before the artillery barrage would wipe out his entire battalion. 40 minutes to decide between obeying orders and saving lives. What he did next should have ended his military career. Instead, it rewrote the field manual on combat communications. But the after-action report documenting what actually happened that day was classified for 60 years because acknowledging Vickers was right meant admitting command had been catastrophically wrong about how radio warfare actually worked. Eddie Vickers grew up in Parsons, Kansas, population 2,000, where his family ran a dairy farm that had been in the family since his grandfather homesteaded the land in 1891. Eddie was the youngest of 4 brothers. 2 of them had already shipped out to Europe by the time Eddie turned 18 in 1943. His father needed him on the farm, needed the help with milking and repairs, and the 100 tasks that kept a small dairy operation running. But Eddie had watched his brothers leave and understood that staying home while other men fought was not something he could live with. He enlisted in January 1944, and the Army looked at his test scores and assigned him to signals training. Radio operators were in desperate demand. The European theater was consuming them at rates that shocked even veteran signals officers. Not from combat deaths, though plenty of radio operators died in artillery strikes and ambushes, but from stress breakdowns, from the crushing responsibility of being the only link between isolated units and higher command, from the knowledge that one missed message or one garbled transmission could cost lives. Eddie had an advantage most trainees lacked. He had grown up listening. On a farm, you learn to hear trouble before you see it. An engine making a sound that means a bearing is about to fail. Cattle lowing in a way that signals distress, not hunger. The difference between wind rattling a loose board and something moving in the barn that should not be there. Eddie applied that listening skill to radio operations. During training at Fort Benning, the instructors taught Morse code, frequency management, encryption protocols, equipment maintenance, standard curriculum. Eddie absorbed it quickly, but what interested him more was the patterns he noticed listening to practice transmissions. Different operators had distinct rhythms. Some sent clean, crisp Morse, others were sloppy with timing. You could identify an operator by their fist, the characteristic way they keyed the transmitter. Eddie started recognizing individual operators across multiple training exercises. His instructors noticed. One told him, "Son, you have an ear for this work. Not everyone does. Some people send and receive like it is a mechanical process. You are hearing it like music." Eddie did not think of it as music exactly, but he understood what the instructor meant. Radio communications had rhythm and structure, and once you heard the patterns, you could process information faster than people who were just mechanically decoding symbols. Eddie shipped to Europe in August 1944, landed in France 2 months after D-Day as a replacement in the 90th Infantry Division. The division had been in continuous combat since the beaches and had burned through radio operators at an ugly rate. Eddie joined the 358th Infantry Regiment and was assigned to battalion communications. His job was maintaining contact between battalion headquarters and the 4 rifle companies spread across the line, relaying orders down and situation reports up, keeping the information flow running that let commanders coordinate operations. It was unglamorous, critical work. Radio operators did not get medals for sending messages correctly, but battalions fell apart when communications failed. Eddie worked 12-hour shifts in a dugout that smelled like wet earth and cigarette smoke, surrounded by maps and codebooks and spare radio parts, listening to the constant traffic of a unit in combat. Rifle companies calling for ammunition resupply, forward observers requesting artillery fire missions, platoon leaders reporting enemy positions, medics requesting evacuation. Hundreds of messages every day, and Eddie processed them with the same careful attention he had given to listening for trouble on the farm. Not just hearing the words, but listening for the patterns, the rhythm, the spaces between transmissions that told you something about the tactical situation. By September 1944, Eddie had noticed something about German radio operations. The Wehrmacht used a predictable system for coordinating artillery. Forward observers would spot targets, call fire missions to artillery batteries using specific frequencies. The batteries would acknowledge and execute, then forward observers would transmit corrections based on where the rounds landed. The system was professional and effective, but it had a vulnerability Eddie started tracking. The Germans rotated through a sequence of frequencies, trying to avoid Allied interception and jamming. The rotation followed a pattern, not a rigid mechanical pattern, but a tactical one based on operational security principles that made sense if you understood their doctrine. Eddie started logging the frequencies, noting when they appeared and in what sequence, building a mental map of how German artillery communications worked. He mentioned it to his sergeant. The sergeant told him to focus on his job and stop worrying about German radio procedures. Eddie kept tracking anyway, not because he thought he would do anything with the information, but because his brain naturally looked for patterns, and once he saw this one, he could not stop noticing it. The crisis came on October 14, 1944, near the town of Mézières-les-Metz in eastern France. The 358th Infantry Regiment had pushed into a salient, advancing faster than adjacent units, and found themselves occupying positions that German artillery could hit from 3 sides. The terrain was open, former farmland with scattered tree lines, but no significant cover. Battalion had dug in as well as they could, but everyone knew they were exposed. The plan was to hold for 48 hours while flanking units caught up, then continue the advance in coordinated fashion. Command had been clear about radio discipline, maintain strict communication security, no unnecessary transmissions. German direction-finding teams could locate radio sources and call in artillery strikes. Every radio operator in the battalion understood the stakes. Unnecessary transmissions got people killed. The first German artillery rounds landed at dawn. Ranging shots, 105mm shells impacting 200 meters north of battalion headquarters. Forward observers reported muzzle flashes from German positions 3 kilometers west. The artillery was accurately registered. The Germans knew where the battalion was, and they were preparing to bracket the position. Battalion Commander Lieutenant Colonel Morrison ordered companies to dig deeper and requested counter-battery fire from division artillery. The response came back negative. Division guns were supporting operations 10 kilometers south. No fire support available for at least 2 hours. Eddie was in the command post monitoring radio traffic when the second salvo landed. Closer this time, 100 meters north. The Germans were walking the fire in, adjusting based on observer corrections, methodically zeroing in on the battalion position. Morrison called the rifle companies and ordered everyone into whatever cover they had. Eddie listened to the company commanders acknowledge, heard the tension in their voices. These were experienced officers who understood what sustained artillery fire would do to troops in open positions. Morrison tried calling division again, requested immediate fire support or permission to withdraw. Division said negative on both, hold position, flanking units would close the gap by nightfall, artillery support would be available in 90 minutes. 90 minutes was a lifetime when German guns were finding their range. The third salvo landed 70 meters north. Fragments shredded trees and peppered dugouts. One round hit close enough to the command post that dirt rained down from the timber roof. Morrison was on the radio demanding fire support with language that was not regulation. Division repeated their orders: hold position, no fires available, dig in and endure. Eddie sat at his radio listening and realized something that made his blood cold. He could hear the German forward observer transmissions. The German spotter was on a frequency Eddie had been tracking for 3 weeks, calling corrections to the artillery battery using the standard Wehrmacht fire mission format: professional, precise, methodical. Eddie grabbed his frequency log, checked his notes, confirmed what he had suspected. The German artillery network was using the predictable rotation he had been tracking. He knew which frequencies they would use next. He knew their timing. He knew their communication pattern. And he knew something else. He could disrupt it. Not through sophisticated jamming. The battalion did not have electronic warfare equipment, but through something simpler, something the manual explicitly forbade, something that would violate every communication security protocol and probably get him court-martialed if it failed. He could transmit on the German frequencies and confuse their fire mission coordination. The technique was called intrusion, broadcasting false messages on enemy frequencies to create confusion. It was forbidden for multiple reasons. It revealed your radio capabilities to the enemy. It could compromise friendly encryption if done carelessly. It violated Geneva Convention protocols about deception in warfare. And most critically, it broke radio silence, which let German direction finding teams locate your position and call artillery strikes directly on your transmitter. Division communications officer had briefed every radio operator in the division on this specific prohibition 3 weeks earlier. Any operator caught using intrusion techniques would face immediate court-martial. But Eddie was watching artillery impacts walk closer to the battalion command post, and he understood that following orders meant 800 men were going to die in the next 40 minutes. He made his decision without asking permission, because asking would mean being told no. He tuned his radio to the German frequency, listened to confirm it was the forward observer network, took a breath, and keyed the transmitter. He sent a fire mission correction in German using the standard Wehrmacht format, round over, left 200 meters. He had learned enough German in signals training to manage basic military terminology. The transmission lasted 4 seconds. He released the key and waited. For 10 seconds, nothing happened. Then the next German salvo landed 200 meters left of the previous impact point. The spotter had accepted Eddie fake correction as genuine. Eddie keyed the transmitter again, sent another correction, round over, add 400 meters. The next salvo landed 400 meters beyond the battalion position. The German artillery battery was shooting at coordinates that put their rounds in empty farmland. The forward observer started transmitting angry corrections, trying to get the guns back on target. Eddie waited for him to finish, then transmitted his own correction contradicting the observer. The Germans had 2 voices on their frequency, both claiming to be forward observers, both sending different corrections. The artillery battery stopped firing. Eddie could hear them requesting authentication codes, trying to figure out which transmission was genuine. Eddie had bought the battalion maybe 10 minutes, 10 minutes before the Germans sorted out the confusion and resumed accurate fire. But 10 minutes was enough time to try something more aggressive. Eddie switched to the next frequency in the German rotation pattern. the one he knew they would move to once they realized their primary frequency was compromised, and he started transmitting false traffic. Not fire missions, but administrative messages, requests for ammunition resupply, situation reports, maintenance issues, everything he could think of to clog the frequency with noise. He keyed the transmitter for 3 seconds, released, keyed again for 5 seconds, released random timing, random content, making it impossible for the Germans to have a clear conversation. He was violating every principle of communication security, broadcasting constantly, revealing his position to any German direction, finding team listening. But he kept transmitting because the alternative was watching artillery shred the battalion. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison realized what Eddie was doing after the 5th transmission. Morrison stormed over to Eddie's position and said, "What the hell do you think you are doing, Corporal? That is a direct violation of division standing orders." Eddie kept transmitting, released the key long enough to say, "Sir, the German forward observer is on these frequencies. I am disrupting their fire coordination. If I stop, they will resume accurate fire on our position." Morrison said, "I did not authorize this. You are going to get us all killed when their DF teams locate your transmitter." Eddie said, "Sir, they are already killing us with artillery. If we do not disrupt their coordination, 800 men die in the next 30 minutes. Morrison stared at Eddie, looked at the radio, looked at the map showing German positions, and made a command decision that probably saved his career and definitely saved the battalion. Morrison said, "Continue your transmission. I am taking responsibility. If division asks, this was my order." Eddie transmitted for 38 minutes. He rotated through 6 different German frequencies, sent false corrections, clogged their networks with garbage traffic, forced their artillery coordination into chaos. The German guns fired sporadically, rounds landing randomly across a square kilometer, none of them hitting the battalion position with accuracy. German forward observers were screaming on the radio, trying to regain control of their networks, but every time they transmitted, Eddie was there sending contradictory information. After 30 minutes, German artillery stopped firing entirely. Either they had given up trying to coordinate through the compromised frequencies, or they had withdrawn to re-establish secure communications. Either way, the battalion was still intact. 90 minutes later, division artillery became available and delivered counter-battery fire that destroyed 2 German gun positions. By nightfall, flanking units had closed the gap and the salient was secured. The 358th Infantry Regiment had held their position with total casualties of 12 wounded, no dead. Given the amount of artillery fire directed at them, the casualty count should have been 10 times higher. Everyone in the battalion knew Eddie unauthorized transmissions had made the difference, but Morrison faced a problem. Eddie had violated direct orders from Division Communications Officer. The prohibition on intrusion techniques was explicit. If Morrison reported what Eddie had done, Division would have to court-martial him to maintain discipline. If Morrison did not report it, he was covering up a violation of standing orders. Morrison chose the third option. He wrote an after-action report that described the battalion successfully defending against German artillery attack, but omitted any mention of how they disrupted enemy fire coordination. He filed the report with Division and told Eddie, "You saved 800 men today, but officially it never happened. We do not talk about your transmission. We do not mention the techniques you used. As far as anyone outside this battalion knows, we just got lucky that German artillery was inaccurate. You understand me, Corporal?" Eddie said, "Yes, sir, I understand." Morrison said, "Good, because if Division finds out what you did, they will crucify you to make an example. And I am not letting that happen to someone who saved my battalion." The secret held for 6 days. Then a signals intelligence officer at division headquarters noticed something in the German radio intercepts from October 14th. The intercepts showed unusual traffic patterns on known German artillery frequencies. multiple contradictory transmissions, communication breakdown that coincided exactly with the 358th Infantry Regiment engagement. The intelligence officer cross-referenced the intercepts with after-action reports and found Morrison report describing German artillery firing inaccurately for 38 minutes. The correlation was obvious. Someone in the 358th had disrupted German communications using intrusion techniques. Division sent an investigation team to interview battalion personnel. Morrison stuck to his story. German artillery was inaccurate. We got lucky. No special techniques were employed. The investigators interviewed Eddie, asked him if he had transmitted on enemy frequencies. Eddie said, "No, sir. I maintained communication security per standing orders." The investigators did not believe him, but they could not prove anything without catching Eddie in a direct lie. And Eddie had learned from his father that the best way to avoid trouble was to say as little as possible. The investigation closed with a notation that someone in the 358th Infantry Regiment had likely used prohibited communications techniques, but without evidence they could not pursue charges. Division Communications Officer issued another directive reminding all units that intrusion techniques were forbidden under any circumstances and violations would result in court-martial. Everyone in the 358th read the directive and understood it was directed at them specifically. Eddie figured he had dodged a bullet and resolved to never pull that stunt again, no matter how desperate the situation. Then, 2 weeks later, it happened again. Different battalion, same situation, German artillery zeroing in on an exposed position, no friendly fire support available. The radio operator in that battalion had heard about Eddie, even though officially nothing had happened. The operator used the same intrusion technique, disrupted German fire coordination, saved his unit. This time, Division could not ignore it because the technique had been used twice and the pattern was undeniable. Division called Morrison and demanded an explanation. Morrison told them the truth. One of his radio operators had noticed a vulnerability in German artillery communications and had exploited it to save the battalion. The technique worked. It saved 800 men, and Morrison would not apologize for a decision that kept his soldiers alive. Division was furious. The communications officer wanted Morrison relieved and Eddie court-martialed. But Division Commander Major General McLain was pragmatic. He called Morrison and Eddie to division headquarters, listened to Eddie explain the frequency patterns and the intrusion technique, asked pointed questions about why it worked and what the risks were. Eddie explained that German artillery relied on predictable frequency rotation, that their forward observers followed standard communication formats, that disrupting the network at critical moments could buy enough time to avoid casualties. McLain asked about the risk of German DF teams locating the transmitter. Eddie said, "Sir, the Germans would need at least 10 minutes to get an accurate fix, and by then I can stop transmitting and move the radio. The risk is acceptable compared to the certainty of taking heavy casualties from uncontested artillery fire." McLain thought about it for 30 seconds, then said, "Communications officer, your standing order prohibiting intrusion techniques is rescinded, effective immediately. Corporal Vickers, you are reassigned to division signals staff, where you will train every radio operator in this division on the technique you developed. We are going to use this until the Germans figure out a counter, and then we are going to find the next vulnerability, because that is how you win wars, not by following doctrine that gets men killed, but by adapting faster than the enemy adapts." Eddie spent the next 4 months training radio operators across 3 divisions. He taught them to recognize German frequency patterns, to identify artillery coordination networks, to execute intrusion techniques that disrupted enemy fire missions. The technique spread through the army, signals officers shared information, other operators refined the method. By January 1945, German artillery effectiveness had dropped measurably in sectors where American forces employed the disruption tactics. German signals intelligence eventually identified what was happening and implemented countermeasures, rotating frequencies more randomly, using authentication codes, shortening transmissions to reduce vulnerability to intrusion. The technique became less effective as the Germans adapted, but for 6 months it saved thousands of American lives by degrading German artillery coordination at critical moments. Eddie Vickers, the 21-year-old farm kid from Kansas, who should have been court-martialed for violating standing orders, had found a tactical vulnerability and exploited it in ways that changed how the army thought about electronic warfare. But the official record remained sanitized. Division never filed reports crediting Eddie with developing the technique. The after-action reports from October 14, 1944, never mentioned his transmissions. When the war ended and the army started writing doctrinal manuals incorporating lessons learned, the intrusion technique was attributed to signals intelligence research, not to a corporal who had violated orders to save his battalion. Eddie was fine with that. He had never wanted recognition. He had just wanted to stop watching people die when he knew he could help. Eddie Vickers came home to Kansas in November 1945, took off the uniform, went back to the dairy farm, married a woman from the next town over, raised 3 children, never talked much about the war. When people asked what he did in the army, he said he was a radio operator, transmitted messages, nothing special. His family knew he had done something significant because occasionally other veterans would show up at the farm. Men who had served in the 358th Infantry Regiment or units Eddie had trained, and they would shake his hand and thank him for keeping them alive. Eddie would offer them coffee and pie and let them talk, but he never elaborated on what he had done. In 1967, a military historian researching electronic warfare in World War II found references to unauthorized intrusion techniques used in late 1944 and tracked down veterans who remembered Eddie. The historian requested Eddie's service records and after-action reports from the National Archives. Most of the relevant documents were missing or had been destroyed in the 1973 fire that consumed millions of Army records. The documents that survived had been sanitized. Eddie's name appeared in routine communications logs, but the October 14th engagement was documented only as successful defense against enemy artillery, with no mention of how the defense succeeded. The historian interviewed Eddie, but Eddie said he did not remember the details clearly. It was a long time ago. He had just done his job the best he could. The historian suspected Eddie was being modest, but without documentation, there was no way to reconstruct exactly what had happened. The intrusion technique was mentioned briefly in classified Army communications studies from the 1950s, but always attributed to unnamed signals personnel, not to specific individuals. The technique itself became irrelevant as radio technology evolved. The vulnerabilities Eddie had exploited in 1944 did not exist in modern communication systems, so military historians focused on more contemporary developments, and the story of the farm kid who had rewritten electronic warfare doctrine faded into obscurity. Eddie Vickers died in 1998 at age 75. His obituary mentioned he had served in World War II as a radio operator with the 90th Infantry Division, that he had farmed in Kansas for 50 years, that he was survived by 3 children and 8 grandchildren. It did not mention that he had saved 800 men by violating direct orders, or that his technique had been used across multiple divisions for 6 months. After his death, his children found a box in the attic containing his Army discharge papers, some photographs, and a letter from Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, dated 1946. The letter said, "Eddie, I never properly thanked you for what you did on October 14, 1944. You made a decision that day that command should have made but did not. You took personal risk to save lives, and I want you to know that every man who came home from that engagement owes you a debt we cannot repay. Your name does not appear in official records, but everyone who was there knows what you did, and we will never forget it." The letter had never been mailed. Morrison had kept it among his papers, and his family had forwarded it to Eddie after Morrison died in 1945. Eddie had saved it, but never shown it to anyone. His children read it and realized their father had been a hero in ways he never discussed. They contacted military historians and shared Morrison's letter and the few documents they had found. The historians were able to piece together parts of the story, but the official after-action reports remained sealed or missing. Without full documentation, Eddie's contribution remained a footnote in electronic warfare history. The breakthrough came in 2004, when a researcher using the Freedom of Information Act requested declassification of World War II communications records. The request was granted, and boxes of documents were released, including after-action reports from the 90th Infantry Division that had been classified not because they contained sensitive information, but because no one had ever requested their release. Among those documents was Morrison's original after-action report from October 14, 1944, the one he had filed before being ordered to sanitize it. The original report stated that Corporal Eddie Vickers had disrupted German artillery coordination through unauthorized use of intrusion techniques on enemy radio frequencies, that the disruption had prevented significant casualties, that Vickers had acted on his own initiative in violation of standing orders, and that Morrison took full responsibility for not stopping the transmissions once they began. The report recommended Vickers for commendation for initiative and technical skill under combat conditions. Division had rejected the recommendation and ordered Morrison to rewrite the report, removing all mention of the technique. The sanitized version was the one that went into official records. The original version had been filed away and forgotten for 60 years. When the original report was declassified, historians finally had documentation proving what Eddie had done. Military communications journals published articles about the case. The Army War College used it as a case study in initiative and adaptive tactics. Eddie's technique was analyzed and compared to modern electronic warfare doctrine. But Eddie was already gone. He never saw the recognition, never knew that the story he had refused to tell had finally been told accurately. The lesson from Eddie Vickers is not about radio technology or electronic warfare tactics. Those are obsolete. The equipment he used does not exist anymore, and the vulnerabilities he exploited were fixed decades ago. The lesson is about initiative, about junior soldiers seeing problems that senior officers miss, about the tension between following orders and doing what is necessary to accomplish the mission. Eddie violated direct orders to save 800 lives. Command tried to bury the story because acknowledging Eddie was right meant admitting they had been wrong about communications doctrine. The report documenting what actually happened was hidden for 60 years, not because it contained military secrets, but because it contradicted the official narrative about how decisions got made and who deserved credit for success. That pattern repeats throughout military history. Junior personnel innovate under pressure, command takes credit or suppresses the innovation depending on whether it makes them look good. The truth gets buried in sanitized reports and missing documentation. And decades later, historians piece together what actually happened from fragments and survivor testimony. Eddie Vickers saved 800 men with a signal trick so simple it violated doctrine. Command tried to court-martial him. Division eventually adopted his technique, and it saved thousands more. But his name appeared in no citations, no commendations, no official recognition until 60 years after the fact, when someone requested declassification of forgotten documents that command never intended to see daylight. The forbidden signal worked, the men lived, and the report that proved it was erased from official history because sometimes the truth is less convenient than the narrative command prefers to maintain. If this story resonated with you, if it reminded you of times when junior personnel saw solutions that leadership missed, there are 3 things you can do. First, like this video, engagement tells platforms that these stories matter, that recognizing initiative and adaptive thinking is more important than preserving institutional narratives. Second, subscribe and enable notifications. We document military operations where the official story does not match what actually happened, where after-action reports were sanitized and the soldiers who made the difference were written out of history. More stories are coming. Third, leave a comment. Tell us where you served. Share if you encountered situations where doing the right thing meant violating standing orders. Connect with other veterans who understand that sometimes the mission requires disobedience, and that the soldiers who save lives are not always the ones who get medals. Eddie Vickers should have been court-martialed for his forbidden signal trick. Instead, he saved 800 men in 40 minutes. Command tried to bury the story. The report proving what happened was hidden for 60 years, but the truth survived because someone requested declassification of forgotten documents. And finally, the farm kid from Kansas got credit for rewriting how the Army thought about electronic warfare. Thank you for your service, thank you for watching, and remember that the most important innovations often come from the people command underestimates.